Okay, so we're talking day 4 here. Uh, when choosing a sample, so we just talked about sampling just before this. We're now going to be talking about how to avoid sampling bias, or what is sampling bias. Okay, so let's look at the definition here. So, when choosing a sample of a population and the method for gathering the desired information about your population, there must be what's called objectivity, right? A lack of objectivity is called bias. So, in this section, we're going to look at the different types of bias, how to identify studies with bias, and how to build studies without bias. Okay, so let's uh, let's begin here. All right, so yeah, this is the sampling bias here. So the sampling bias is your most basic standard type of bias, and it occurs when your um, sample does not reflect the characteristics of the population. So remember what sampling is you've identified some sort of population that you want to gather information from, and then you go out and you ask some questions to these people, um, or whatever. But as you ask these questions, the actual or you choose the people that you ask questions to, the people who end up getting into this sample are sort of skewed in one direction or another in terms of their opinions and different things like that. And they don't actually represent the population. So um, basically, what we would say here is that your sampling bias is that the sample does not represent the population for whatever reason. Okay. Um, so a couple of classic examples of sampling bias would be you go to survey high school, right? And your population is a high school, and you want to know how to spend money for the high school, but you go, instead of asking just everybody at the high school, you go to like the football game or something, or the hockey game, and you go and you ask the people at the hockey game, how should we spend this extra money on our high school, right? And so you're going to get some opinions. The issue is that most of those people are at the hockey game and they're interested in hockey, and their responses are going to be probably, possibly skewed in the direction of spending the money on hockey. Okay. Um, and so that's it as well, right? Then there's another one where it's like another classic example would be like, um, you know, somebody wants to know, in a particular, state or province or something like that, how many households have a computer, right? How many households have a computer in their so you send out a survey, but you send that survey through email, all right? And so as a result, you're going to get responses to this survey, but people who get the response, well, they have to have a computer in the first place. So that's kind of dumb. And so in the end, would be a sampling bias. All right. Next one. is a non-response bias. A non-response bias occurs when a particular group or groups um, is or are underrepresented in a survey because they choose to not participate. Okay, and this is sort of a delicate form of the sampling bias. So, but rather than sort of the person in charge of the study, sort of, so these are similar, right? Because you know, well, I'll tell you why they're similar in a moment. Anyway, so certain parts of the population choose to not respond. So you've got a population, and you somehow try and send out some surveys, and a particular group of people choose to not respond. So therefore they're underrepresented, and so therefore your sample that you did get doesn't fully recognize the proportions of the characteristics of the population that you're attempting to sample. Okay, so this is a sampling bias. The only difference between this sampling bias and this one is that the person running the sample is more in charge of this one, whereas the people responding are a little bit more in charge of this one. Okay. Um, anyway, so this would be kind of like a scenario where you are doing a free response sample, and you sort of let anyone walking by answer. So you could be like, maybe you're wanting to know about some sort of environmental issue in your cafeteria in your school, and you're saying, oh, let's ask some people how they feel about this kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden, so you ask all these people, but in the end, only half of them are like, oh no, I don't have time to answer that. And then the ones who do have time answer it, but those are the people who have strong feelings about this information, and the other ones maybe don't, and so therefore you end up getting information based, of people who just happen to have strong feelings about things rather than you know people who don't. All right, a measurement bias now is the next one. A measurement of bias occurs when the data collection method consistently either under or overrepresents characteristics of a population. And so this is basically specifically, this is a type of sampling bias as well, but this is where the data collecting causes a misrepresentation in the of the population. Opinion, I guess. Of the population's opinion. Sorry about all the spelling mistakes there. So, what is this? What is this going to be? So, basically, the act of actually going out and getting the opinions skews people's opinion. Okay, and how does this work? It's kind of like, um, in a way, it's kind of like a thing about physics too. It's like, if I measure the velocity of a particle by touching the particle somehow, and then I've altered its velocity, and so therefore, do I actually have the correct velocity? Right? That would be like a physics example. That would be a measurement bias. The act of actually measuring the particle changes its velocity, and so I screwed it all up. Okay. So in non-physics scenarios, some examples of this would be, you know, um, we got to survey, we got to figure out if people are speeding in a particular area so we can determine whether or not it's a safe area to, place crosswalks, or do we need crosswalks with lights, or do we need maybe, what kind of crosswalks do we need? So we have to determine whether or not, what's the average speed limit, are people speeding, right? But in order to determine whether or not people are speeding, they actually place um, like a police officer in the area, like sitting on the corner measuring people's speed limits. Okay. So you would say, well, okay, that seems fine. But then if you think about it a little bit, you would think, well, wait a minute. If these people see, as they're driving up, see a police officer there in front of them, they might slow down. And so therefore, you're not going to get the true, actual, proper average speed of the drivers, because in the end, you're having some police officer take the measurements. So that would be a measurement bias. The act of asking a police officer rather than like a hidden camera, it is causing people to alter their speed, right? Um, Another measurement bias would be something like loaded questions. So to put some sort of um, very emotional statement in the question in order to skew someone's in order to skew someone's feelings so that they respond in a particular way immediately. Um, so for example, um, you one of the classic examples. This was back. You would say, you want to know how people feel about smoking in restaurants, right? But in a way, you could ask the question like this: do you feel like the government has a right to tell you whether or not you can smoke in a restaurant, right? And people would be like, no, maybe, or other people would say yes. And so in the end, but it depends. What are you trying to figure out? Are you trying to figure out people's feelings on smoking in restaurants, or are you trying to figure out people's feelings on whether or not they like to be controlled by the government? And so, in a way, um, you've sort of screwed up the response to this question by asking it in this sort of volatile, emotional manner. You know what I mean? So that would be a measurement bias, what would be called like a loaded question. Okay. And then the last one here is an actual response bias. Okay. And this is a response bias where people actually respond. Okay. And they purposefully give the incorrect information for whatever reason, either due to embarrassment or their own personal gain, or because they are not anonymous and they don't want to sort of let people know what they think, or for whatever reason. So response bias occurs when participants in a survey deliberately give false or misleading answers, and it could be for whatever reason. So where the participants give false answers. And the classic example of this is, um, you know, um, teacher explained everything. So I explain everything in class, and then, you know, I just go, hey, does everybody have any questions? Or does everybody understand what I just said? And it's a class full of 30 people. And maybe 10 of them didn't understand it. But all 10 of those people say, they don't say anything because they're a little embarrassed or something, because they don't want to admit that they don't understand what was just explained or whatever. Okay, and so that would be what would be called a response bias. So they would, you know, it could be a non-response bias if they don't say anything. But if they say like, "Yes, I understand," everybody raises their hand. Raise your hand if you understand what I said. Basically, So they raise their hand, they respond, but they gave a false answer out of embarrassment. All right. So here's a couple of questions here we're going to talk about here, and we'll just do an example. Identify the type of bias in the following two surveys. Oh, there's not two, there's five. And suggest how we might eliminate this bias. Sorry, there's not five, there's four. Huh. Parents of high school students were asked, do you think that students should be released from school a half an hour early on Friday, free to run around and get into trouble? Okay, so going back up to our thing, this is a measurement bias because the act of measuring this is a loaded question, and this is a measurement bias. Okay, and how do we fix this? You basically get rid of this, and or for whatever reason, if you say free to run around and get into trouble, and you're asking parents this nonetheless. You're sort of in a way you're sort of putting fear into the parents, and you'd be like, oh wait, if they're going to run around and get into trouble, obviously no, we shouldn't let them out a half hour early on Friday. You kind of see what I'm saying? All right, next question is Hershey's Chocolate conducts a survey of a group of children and asks if they should be permitted to eat unlimited amounts of candy. All right, so this is clearly bias, sampling bias, right? And well, I'm going to go with the sampling bias here because you're in a way choosing the. It's like going to that football game, it's like going to that hockey game and asking hockey players how to spend money at the school. So in a way here, you're going to a group of kids and asking if they should be allowed to eat candy when they're really, not really the population that should be deciding this kind of information. Or yeah, you can ask them, but you got to ask maybe non-children as well, and some doctors and other things like that, right? So this would be a sampling bias, right? And how do you fix this? You don't necessarily ask only children, right? A survey asks the audience at a high school hockey game, should the school use its funds for more sports or music classes? Oh, I kind of talked about this one already. And again, this is a sample bias. How do we fix it? Don't go to the hockey game. Ask everybody in the school. Survey is emailed to all customers who shopped at an electronics store in the past year, but only 10% of the customers responded. This would be a non-response bias, right? Because some people possibly are not responding, okay? So how do you fix that? Um, in a way, you sort of force people. So this survey was emailed to all the customers who shopped at the electronics store in the past year. What you do is I don't know, I guess to get more people to answer, you give them a free coupon or something if they answer. You could force people to answer in a way in order to get out of the store or in order to make their purchase. You know what I mean? Last one is who in the class understands the current material, right? And that's like the one that I talked about earlier, where this would be a response bias. So everybody in the class would be like, oh, yeah, I get it. And so, how do you eliminate that bias? Excuse me. What you do is you actually ask each individual person, not do you understand the material, but you actually ask them a question to test whether or not they understand the material, right? Which is why I have to give you guys tests on this stuff rather than just, calling you up and being like, hey, do you understand that section? You do? Oh, great. Okay, here you go. Anyway, so that would be a response bias. All right.